Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. As always, thank you so much for listening. And as always, thank you for the letters you send to us, the questions. Got some great stuff in the past couple of weeks. I read every one of them. And also, thank you very much to those of you who have decided to support the show financially. We so need it and we so appreciate it.
So you really were the provocateur here based on a letter that we received.
What are you talking about?
You know, I've been dreading this program because from the moment that the thing happened on January 6th, because of a lifetime of trying to look at the world through the lens of Thomas Jefferson, I thought, uh-oh, here we go, because Jefferson said he liked a little rebellion now and then. He said the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. He said sometimes these sort of insurrectionists are misguided, but that doesn't mean we should overreact. We should try to conciliate them and listen to their point of view and educate them if we can. And he said that the French Revolution was a righteous thing, even if it had killed everybody except one Adam and one Eve. And so I thought, I'm going to be forced as a Jefferson pretender and a Jefferson scholar to argue that he probably would have been fairly tolerant of what happened on January 6th, although I think Jefferson is going to say, is there any evidence that the election was stolen? Because wouldn't that be an important factor here? But I knew you were going to do this, David, and you heard me during the program squirming, bobbing and weaving, trying to... The hesitation, because I was so... First of all, you got to be really careful in a situation like this. This is not about, who won the Super Bowl and whether the referees were fair. This is about the very fabric of our sense of order and the rule of law in our republic. And yet Jefferson, of all of the founding fathers, if you had asked Hamilton, he would have said, hang them all. If you had asked Washington, he would have said, try them all and pardon them, but make sure they get it, that this is unacceptable. Jefferson, of all the founding fathers, is the one and only one who's going to say, how big a deal really was it? And so I've been dreading this because this is a part of Jefferson I don't frankly understand. But I do agree with you that his point of view in that famous letter to Madison, which I think we should post, is really important, because what he's saying is it's easy to overreact too, folks. It's easy to overreact when you put down an insurrection and to fail to see whatever legitimacy they thought they saw in their action.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's probably the biggest takeaway from that letter to Madison is that we can overreact. And it was an interesting discussion. I enjoyed it very much.
Yeah, I had a heart attack at minute 27, but thanks a lot.
I have to say that this whole conversation was inspired by a listener letter. Dan Doherty sent it in, asking questions about Shays Rebellion. And Dan, I hope I did you justice. It was a fine letter.
I'm teaching this online Constitution course that's going great guns. I'm going to probably do another section of it in the late summer or early fall. But we've been talking about this. The Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia between May 25th and September 17th of 1787 was precipitated by Shays Rebellion. That happened in Western Massachusetts. People were horrified. Everybody else except Jefferson was horrified. And they said, we've got to have a much stronger central government so that this sort of thing can be prevented or put down. And so if you read for example, the statements of Elbridge Gerry, who was a Massachusetts delegate, you can see that he's panic-stricken over what happened in Shays Rebellion. And so there probably would not have been a constitutional convention when it happened if there hadn't been this armed farmers' protest movement. But I hasten to add, as I did, I think, very clearly and carefully in the program, David, that their cause was largely just, that this was not like who stole the election with no evidence.
Yeah, but Jefferson didn't even take that into account, and we'll let this come out in the show, but in this letter that he wrote to Madison and from Paris, so he was an ocean away from all this, he says, I say nothing of its motives. They were founded in ignorance, not wickedness. What country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance? Let them take arms.
Go back to the most important clause there, innocence and wickedness. Read that again.
I say nothing of its motives. They were founded in ignorance, not wickedness.
All right, so that's the question, right?
But to me, that's really clear. That's why I don't struggle with this with Jefferson at all. He's saying we're Americans, our intentions are good, but we might be misguided.
Yes, and so you have to ask yourself whether the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th were actuated by ignorance or wickedness or both or what.
When it first happened, I was so angry. I was so glad to find out they were using facial recognition and go arrest every one of those people and prosecute them and put them in jail. And a couple weeks later, I'm going, if I really believed that, how would I react? It's ignorance, not wickedness, is what Jefferson says, and I'm trying to get myself there.
Well, I do.
That's about all I'm going to confess about it right now.
There was a very large portion of what I would call ignorance. In other words, I think lovers of America, patriots, ardent lovers of America, believed that the election had been stolen because President Trump and his cronies told them so, which was a wicked wicked thing to do. I don't think it was an ignorant thing to do. They were wicked in stirring this up, but the people were more ignorant than they were wicked, and they actually thought they were doing the right thing. I agree with you to that point. And so my anger is not at them, although I have some. It's diminishing. My anger is at the demagogues who stirred this thing up. And there is punishment that needs to come to them. And unfortunately, as usual, they're not going to be punished. Ted Cruz is going to remain in the Senate. Josh Hawley is going to remain in the Senate. They'll probably be reelected when it comes by larger majorities. Lindsey Graham, who is one of the most shameless people who's ever been in political life during my lifetime, will probably be rewarded. So the people who are winding up being indicted are the dupes, I would call them, the well-meaning, patriotic dupes who took this nonsense seriously.
Pardon me, sir, but it doesn't sound like you're quite over it yet. But be that as it may, I'm going to warn Mr. Jefferson, there's another one of these conversations coming.
Oh, boy.
And again, it's going to be based on a letter from one of our listeners, Doug Stein, who sent me a link to an article in the Washington Post by Caitlin Marie Carter titled, What the 1798 Sedition Act Got Right and What It Means Today. I sent you a copy of this, and I'm really hoping that Mr. Jefferson will speak to me about that in the coming weeks. But we should probably go to this week's show.
I just want everyone to know how difficult this was today, David, and how careful I've tried to be as Jefferson in responding to this, and how troubled I am, both as a humanities scholar and an American patriot, not only at what happened, but in trying to figure out what Jefferson's response would be, and to trying to make sense of his response and to read generous implications into Jefferson's letters about rebellion, because I think he's right in some really important respects. But in a situation like this, I get pretty hesitant because so much is at stake. So thanks, everyone, for listening. Keep them cards and letters coming. We so appreciate our listeners who send their questions and thoughts, who offer admiration and criticism, and who keep us honest. That's the best thing, I believe, about the Jefferson Hour. And so I thank all of you. And thanks to you, David, for brokering this program.
Very good, sir. And with that, I think we should note that we're awfully close to this to make any real historical judgment or even a personal one. But time shall heal all wounds. And with that, shall we go to the show?
Indeed, let's do.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and I'm so pleased to be speaking with you, President Jefferson. Good day to you, sir.
Good day to you, my dear citizen.
Mr. Jefferson, it's extremely cold in my part of the country. You have admonished me in the past for choosing to live in such what I think you've called an inhospitable climate, but it is very cold here, and a great deal of the United States has suffered a cold winter and record amounts of snow. We, in my time, have the modern conveniences of heating and conditioning our air to keep it comfortable within our homes. It got me to thinking, sir, it must have been far different in your time. I endured temperatures this morning that were 20 below zero Fahrenheit, and I can't imagine how somebody during your time would endure such temperatures, sir.
Well, I would not believe what you're saying if it weren't for the records of the Lewis and Clark expedition. My friend and protege Meriwether Lewis spent a winter in your Dakota between late October 1804 and early April 1805. And I had encouraged him, in fact, instructed him to keep weather data, to take down the temperature at least twice a day at dawn and again in late afternoon, to chart the winds, to make notes about cloud cover and precipitation and anything else that might be interesting for others to study. And he dutifully performed that service for us. And this was the first weather data that we were getting from the new Louisiana territory. And he reports that on one occasion, it's hard to believe that this can have been true, that it was 43 degrees below zero at this wooden compound they built called Fort Mandan. Now, at some point, their thermometers actually broke because they were pretty primitive by your standards. But if it's true, 43 degrees below zero is a chill that I would never voluntarily submit myself to. And he also said that the wind blows incessantly on the northern Missouri, on the upper Great Plains, and that the wind proved to be another significant factor that had made the cold even more disagreeable than it otherwise would have been. I live in the balmy and temperate world of Monticello. It does freeze there, but not particularly often. It's more likely to rain than to snow. And we had fireplaces. It was hard to keep those fireplaces going. It's an expensive business, and you cut down a lot of trees in order to do it. So I can't say I congratulate you for choosing to live in such a place. I don't think any rational person would.
Noted, Mr. Jefferson. Join me in hoping that everyone stays warm and safe during this cold snap, sir.
Indeed. Well, the good news is that the winter solstice has occurred late in December. We understood that in my time. And now every single day brings more light. And with more light in the Northern Hemisphere comes more heat. And so I'm guessing the time is now on your side, and that within, I would like to say a few weeks, but I'm sure in your case it's a few months, you will be able to go outside in your shirt sleeves.
Well, let's hope so, and get to the garden during that time. Sir, we received a letter from one of your listeners, a Dan Doherty, quite a lengthy letter, asking about Shays Rebellion. I wonder if we could speak about that this week, sir.
Yes, Daniel Shays was a veteran of the Revolutionary War. I believe that he was at Bunker Hill. I was in Paris when all of this occurred, so my understanding of it may be at some detachment. But as I understood it, there were some significant economic dislocations and disruptions that came from the war and the aftermath of the war, and that the farmers of western Massachusetts were unable to pay their bills, to pay for services, to pay for seed, or to pay their mortgages, and that this was the spark of an agrarian rebellion in the western parts of that state. Is that correct, sir?
Yes, sir. He quotes a letter that you wrote, a very famous letter that you wrote, your Tree of Liberty letter that you wrote to Mr. Madison. And he says of Shays Rebellion, Jefferson wrote, "I say nothing of its motives. They were founded in ignorance, not wickedness. What country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance? Let them take arms."
Indeed, I stand by that letter. The important thing to remember is that liberty the rights of man are the most important thing, and that we enter into a government so that it will stay out of our way as much as possible, but be an arbitrator in certain disputes and provide certain very limited and specifically enumerated services for a constitution which we have ratified, that we have explicitly endorsed. And so I believe in the consent of the governed. And when a government, like the one in Massachusetts, ceases to be sensitive to the needs of its citizens, those citizens should remonstrate. They should petition. They should send letters to their state legislators or the governor. They should march in the capital of their state if necessary. They have a right to insist that a government that they helped to create is responsive to their needs. And if that government proves to be indifferent to their concerns or hostile to their concerns, then the people need to up the ante a bit and perhaps very carefully move towards a more strenuous level of protest. And from time to time, this will break out into armed rebellion. That may be an exaggeration. Pitchforks and torches and maybe some tarring and feathering or some bullying and intimidation, maybe the barricading of a courthouse or the intimidation of a judge or a justice of the peace. I'm not in favor of violence ever, of course, but there are times when it's necessary. And so rather than join the chorus in America of people condemning this as mobocracy and chaos and mob action and violence and pandemonium and the end of civilization as we know it. And believe me, all of those responses came from the establishment classes in the United States when Shays Rebellion broke out in 1786. I chose another path and said, well, obviously we're not friendly to violence and we like peaceful adjustment of human differences, but there are times when these things happen. I admitted that the people might be ignorant or not in full possession of the facts, but we shouldn't overreact to these rebellions. And I even believe that in a certain way, if you take the long view, say from Mars or Jupiter, a little rebellion now and then is not such a bad thing. It reminds government that government exists to serve us and not the other way around. It puts government on warning that the people are strong, and if necessary, they will engage in the same sort of revolutionary action that we all find so acceptable for the 13 colonies in 1775 and 1776 and through the course of the Revolutionary War. We regard that as a heroic moment in the history of man. Well, Daniel Shays certainly didn't think that he was some sort of a nihilist or a mere rabble-rouser. Presumably he had an important point of view. It would be worth our knowing what that point of view is before we condemn him out of hand or repress that rebellion.
Mr. Doherty has written particularly bringing up Shays Rebellion because of events of January 6th, a group of protesters, a small part of a larger gathering that stormed the Capitol and forced their way inside. It was quite violent, led to deaths. This was a pretty serious event, and I believe he's looking for parallels between Shays Rebellion and now. You wrote, sir, if they remain quiet under such misconceptions, it is lethargy, the forerunner of death to public liberty.
Absolutely. I say again, lethargy is the forerunner to the death of public liberty. So I cannot tell you whether the events that you speak of on January 6th in your era were just or unjust. But I can tell you this, that Daniel Shays had a point of view. So you have Massachusetts, and on the eastern end of Massachusetts, on the shoreline, were the commercial interests, the people who were building boats and engaged in trade or whaling ships, and the banks and insurance companies that propped up those industries. And they had an inordinate presence in the state legislature of Massachusetts. In other words, the legislature was skewed on behalf of the properties or the privileged classes, the creditor classes. And the great majority of the Massachusetts population did not engage in those enterprises. They were small family farmers or hunters out on the western frontier, and they were underrepresented in the state legislature of Massachusetts. And so when they asked for relief for debts that were no fault of their own. In other words, they were not bad managers of their farms. Maybe some of them were, but most of them were just trying to eke out a living on the land, and the disruptions in the economy attendant upon the revolution and its aftermath had made it impossible for them to pay their bills. There was a lack of currency in Western Massachusetts and in other states, and so they were asking for relief. But because they were not adequately represented in the state legislature, the creditor class did nothing for them. In fact, they sneered at them and dismissed them and denounced them and said that they were people trying to take advantage of the government of Massachusetts. And so only after they had been denied adequate representation or any substantive relief, or for that matter, any sensitivity to their concerns, then and only then they picked up their pitchforks and their muskets and decided that they must take action into their own hands. What else could they do? Otherwise, they would all lose their farms and they would become an urban mass of people living in Boston or Springfield and unable to earn a living. And so they rebelled. I believe that justice was on their side. I don't condone what they did, but I believe that the justice was on their side. And if Massachusetts had been a truly representative system, they would have had a voice in the legislature, and that voice would have prevented the creditor class from ignoring their concerns as completely as they did. So it was really a class issue, and it was an economic issue, and it was an issue of representation.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay Jenkinson. We're speaking with President Jefferson this week about Shays Rebellion and his own statement that I like a little rebellion now and then. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. We're speaking with Mr. Jefferson this week about Shays Rebellion and some parallels to contemporary American events. Mr. Jefferson, there were a couple of reasons that Shays Rebellion occurred. Could you share those with us?
Well, the reason was, as I have said, that the state legislature was indifferent to or hostile to the concerns of these Western farmers. And so when they had exhausted all peaceful means, and as I understand it, they did everything that you would want them to do to call attention to their plight, then and only then did they resort to a modest amount of violence. They stopped some sales on farms, some auctions. They shut down some courthouses so that foreclosures couldn't occur. They bullied a few people and tarred and feathered a few people, but it really was a fairly mild rebellion. But my point, and it's a very important point that I need to make, especially if you're drawing comparisons between my time and yours, is that their cause was just. These were not people who were irresponsible and unwilling to pay their bills, unwilling to work hard to scratch out a living on the soils of Massachusetts. These were war veterans, some of them, many of them, and some of them had distinguished themselves during the Revolutionary War. They just wanted a fair shake. They wanted to be able to pursue their livelihood with an economy that actually worked and understood their particular needs. And so if their cause was just, I am certainly much more willing to credit it than I would if their cause was unjust. If they were just a bunch of anarchists who were looking for trouble, then I would denounce them. And certainly the first business of any society is to restore order. You can't allow mayhem to occur, or it will become a habit and it will grow. But I want to hear what's on the minds of the people who are protesting before I rush to judgment. That's my point.
Mr. Doherty, I think, agrees with you. He writes, the motives of those who stormed the Capitol were diverse and, at the individual level, often multiple. But while some of the rebels were guided by wickedness, there were surely many who were motivated first and foremost by the belief that the election had been stolen from their preferred candidate. Sir, you wrote that they may have been led by facts that were, quote, misconceived. After all, the people cannot be all and always well informed.
Well, this was particularly true in my time when we had a very weak system of newspapers and communications were slow and very imprecise. And so people literally could not keep abreast of things that were happening in their state capitals. And most people lived a very localized life with very little information beyond their own county, much less beyond their own state. But in my letter to Madison about this, so I wrote to a number of different people about this. Abigail Adams, I think I shocked her by saying I like a little rebellion now and then. To Madison, I wrote at greater length. He was my closest friend. And I said, if they are wrong, if the rebels are wrong, and maybe they are, then we should explain to them the true facts of the case and try to convince them to see things in a more precise way. In other words, it's in our interest to try to bring people along and bring them up to speed and inform them, especially to counter bad ideas or rumors or misconceptions that are being bandied about, sometimes by people who are demagogues. So it's in our interest to correct their mistakes, if we can, by giving them the information that they need to make probably a more responsible decision about how to react to the circumstances of their lives. That's the most important thing, to inform them, to enlighten them. If they're simply wrong, of course we must restore order. The orderly business of a society is essential to a thriving republic. But I always think that the two things happen. We overreact, and this is what I said also to Madison, that in the way we overreact, we often install the very tyranny that the rebellion rose to address. In other words, we make it worse, not better, by overreacting to this. Now, again, I'm not making any comment on your world and the things that happened in early January of your era. I'm only talking about how I see rebellion, how I think we should react to rebels, how I think we should listen to them, how they almost always have a significant point of view. I don't think people rebel for no reason. And if they're misguided, we must inform them. Of course, we must restore order. If they're mere anarchists and nihilists and ruffians and miscreants, then of course they have to pay the price for their uses of violence.
But in your letter to Mr. Madison, you were pretty generous towards them. In fact, you wrote, the remedy is to set them right as to the facts, pardon and pacify them.
Absolutely. That's the right thing to do. Now, again, I speak for my time, not yours. These farmers in Western Massachusetts, A, had a point of view, and B, were not shooting people indiscriminately. They were not trying to destroy a courthouse or to do things that would be called vandalism. Their attempt was to stop these foreclosures from continuing because they believed that they were unjust. And therefore, they upped the ante to a certain level of violence. Once the creditor class and the government of Massachusetts sent out a militia to handle this, they dispersed pretty quickly, and things calmed down in short order. But I'll tell you the result of all this, sir. The result was the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. That's what propelled those 55 delegates from around the country to go to Philadelphia. The Articles of Confederation were failing and needed to be reformed, but the precipitating cause was Shays Rebellion, and people like John Adams and Abigail Adams, or James Madison, George Washington, Rufus King, Alexander Hamilton, Gouverneur Morris, the great figures of American life were so appalled by this outburst by the farmers of Massachusetts that they came together to form a much stronger centralized government that would have the authority to put down such rebellions. And one of the enumerated powers in the first article of the Constitution of the United States is the capacity for the government to put down insurrections. And so this was, I think, an overreaction. I thought the Articles of Confederation were better than their critics said, but at any rate, if it hadn't been for Shays Rebellion, I doubt that there would have been a quorum in Philadelphia.
Shays Rebellion, if I understand you correctly, sir, led to strengthening the federal government. Is that correct?
Strengthening it and over-strengthening it. I think the new Constitution, aside from the fatal flaw of not containing a Bill of Rights, was too centralized and too strong. And if that were the case in 1787, imagine how much it would grow that central government over time. And so I believe if there hadn't been a Shays Rebellion, we would have limped along with the Articles. We probably would have reformed them somewhat on commercial interests and taxation interests and a stronger executive. But I don't think that we would have gone as far as we went. Take a look at Elbridge Gerry. He was a Massachusetts delegate to the Constitutional Convention, and he was in a panic mode for most of that summer about the late insurrections on the western frontier of Massachusetts. He talked endlessly about too much democracy, these mobs and people out of control, and they must be taught to obey and so on. All that talk, in my view, shows a really significant lack of sensitivity to the needs of those farmers.
You, sir, as a scholar, do something that I admire, and that is you take all of these facts, all of this evidence and occurrences, and you're able to distill them down into simple, understandable language. In your letter to Madison, you wrote, "Societies exist under three forms, sufficiently distinguishable. 1, without government, as among our Indians. 2, under governments, wherein the will of everyone has a just influence, as is in the case in England in a slight degree, and in our states in a great one. And 3, under governments of force, as is the case in all other monarchies and in most other republics."
Yes, this is a very important letter, privately written to James Madison. I didn't publish it, but it wasn't an op-ed piece, but it was a letter to the father of the Constitution, James Madison, and my closest friend. And I used my correspondence with James Madison to try out ideas, and I was more willing to explore the possibilities of American life with him than I would have been willing with almost anybody else. So keeping that in mind. But what I said there was there are three types of government. There's no government, and that I take to be the Lakota and the Cheyenne and the Crow and the Clatsop and the Walla Walla and the Nez Perce, the native peoples that Mr. Lewis met on his famous tour. They have no constitutions. They have no laws, as far as one can tell. They work entirely in small bands according to custom, and that seems to work for them. Well, that's not going to work for us because we're too many in number. We're not small bands of 50, 100, 200 people, and we also have habits inherited from European tradition. So that's not going to work. But that would be the ideal if we could really educate our people to the maximum extent possible. Then I would want little or even no government. And then on the other end, there's tyranny, and that's really the history of the world, one tyranny after the next. We have oligarchs, we have aristocrats, we have tyrants, we have despots, we have dictators, we have kings, we have bishops.
A government of wolves over sheep.
That's the history of the world. And so we were trying to do something in between. And so that in between is a fairly wide spectrum. So on the more conservative end of that middle ground, you have people like John Adams or Gouverneur Morris, or even at the Constitutional Convention, James Madison. They wanted a strong central government, and at the other end of that middle ground, you have people like Luther Martin of Maryland and Patrick Henry of Virginia and Thomas Paine, and I would put myself there too. And we wanted the most limited government possible that would still be able to do the work of government, that is, keep order and do things government must do. And so that's the ideal, is somewhere in that middle ground to find what works for your population, your geography, your economy, your habits of the heart. And the founding fathers who met in Philadelphia occupied that ground. They replaced the Articles and put in a stronger constitution, too strong in my opinion, but they were still within the ground of what is acceptable, what is truly a republic, except for Hamilton, who wanted a monarchy, but he's sort of an outlier in this conversation. So that's where we were. And so if you look again at what was going on in Massachusetts, if there had been fair representation of all of the people of Massachusetts, including the Western farmers, probably there would have been no rebellion. But they felt that they were disenfranchised by the privileged class, the establishment class, the the creditor class, the propertied classes that were over on the eastern seaboard of Massachusetts in places like Boston, and they felt that they had no voice in their own affairs. And so instead of granting them that voice by redistricting and reapportioning the legislature, the propertied classes simply regarded them as anarchists and ruffians who must be crushed. And I think that's exactly the wrong thing to do. The right thing to do is to hear what their concerns are and to try to meet them if they're just. And if their concerns are unjust, as they often will be, then to inform them and to try to show them the injustice of their cause, but not simply to send out the largest armed force that you can muster to put them down.
Going back to Mr. Doherty's letter, he talks about your remedies for this, including pardoning the rebels, and says, "My thoughts are that doing so, even if just a little, might facilitate the setting of people right as to the facts. And even without changed beliefs, national unity might be helped. Worth consideration," he feels.
Yes, I do believe in pardoning. George Washington pardoned many of the people who were engaged in the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794, a similar farmers' protest movement. You arrest them, you jail the leaders, you make their lives somewhat difficult. I think that's important. But then when calmness and order have been restored, it's in the interests of the society to be as generous and forgiving as possible of certainly of the followers, maybe not always of the leaders of these rebellions. And we need to keep in mind, sir, that we're all Americans, that the Daniel Shays and his cohort of farmers were Americans. They were not only Americans, but they were veterans. They were people who had helped to secure our liberty. They were growing food to feed their neighbors, to feed the people of Massachusetts and beyond. And the people in the creditor class, although I think that they were behaving in a high-handed and unjust way, they too are Americans. And so we need to remember this, that it's not a good idea for Americans to be either attacking each other in violence or using whatever levers of power they have to damage the other group. It's in our interest to move back towards social harmony, forbearance, forgiveness, tolerance, pardoning, whatever it is, as quickly as possible. And I agree with the writer of this letter that the milder the response by the government, the more likely you are to persuade some of the hotheads, some of the rebels, that they at least live in a society that wants to maintain harmony if possible.
Let me share Mr. Doherty's final thought from his letter. He writes, "Jefferson's primary commitment, at least in words, was to liberty. As is perhaps inevitable in a comfortable society, I believe that the vast majority of Americans and an even greater majority of the elite are first and foremost committed to the rule of law and legal process."
Yes, I think that's true. I think that order is at one end of the spectrum and liberty is at the other. And if you have too much order, you have despotism. It may be efficient and it may be without violence. There's an advantage to it, but the disadvantage is enormous, which is that it swallows up human liberty and in many cases human enterprise and creativity. At the other end of the spectrum, if you err on the side of liberty, which I would be on the whole more likely to do, then you have some disorder. There is a kind of yeasty disorderliness, a sort of a turbulence in a truly free society, because when people are free, they express their frustrations. If you suppress them enough, if you lord it over them enough, you can probably maintain a peace, but it is not a peace where people feel that they are in pursuit of happiness or that their lives are likely to be happy or gratifying. And so you need to find some balance in these two things. And most people, George Washington would be one of them, would prefer order to liberty if you had to choose straight up and straight down. And if I had to choose straight up and straight down, of course I love order, but I love liberty as much. And I would want us to be at least extremely sympathetic to the people who are the champions of liberty. I think that they are keeping alive something that's essential in a free society, and even their wrong-headed expressions of rage and frustration are, in a sense, a sign of the health of the society, because once you get a nation of sheep where they just keep their heads down and just put potatoes on the table and raise their children and lose interest in questions of human happiness and liberty, then that's, in my opinion, not a society worth living in.
Understood. Thank you, Mr. Jefferson, and thanks to Mr. Doherty for this letter. And to you, sir, I wish you good health and stay warm during these cold times if you can.
I wish you would all just move to Virginia.
Very good, Mr. Jefferson. We need to take a short break. When we return, we'll be speaking with the gentleman who portrays President Jefferson, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to this edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I am out of my wig and tights and buckled shoes now. I am a humanities scholar of the early 21st century, sitting across, virtually at least, from the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. David Swenson. And David, this was a hard program for me. Since the events of January 6th, I have been wrestling with this. Because if you turn to Jefferson and say, well, what would Jefferson say about the assault on the United States Capitol? We don't know, of course, and you heard me carefully not commenting on it in today's program. But the fact is that he probably would have, he certainly would have said that it's easy to overreact. He certainly would have said, how serious was it? Okay, so a chair was broken. So, there were people killed, so obviously this is no laughing matter. But I think Jefferson would be more likely to want to play down the havoc and to find a way to learn something from it rather than to condemn it out of hand. I think the fundamental difference, however, in my opinion, this is my opinion, but I think it's backed by the facts, is that the people who were engaged in Shays Rebellion had a legitimate concern, a legitimate beef that they were right. They were certainly partly right, and they had exhausted all peaceful means. And I think the people that participated in the January 6th insurrection were misled that's the best thing you can say of them, and that they had come to believe or pretend to believe that the election had actually been stolen and that Donald Trump was the rightful 46th president of the United States, and that he had won, and possibly by a landslide. I think those are all wrong, demonstrably wrong. They're wrong in evidence. There have been more than 60 court cases to test this, including 2 cases that reached the level of the Supreme Court, that the election counts had been recounted and audited, and state certifying boards had passed their own certifications of the election so that every test was met. And the only way that you can believe that the election was stolen is to believe that there was a very widespread conspiracy, including Republican-appointed or Republican-elected state election officials in a number of states, and that the Supreme Court, with 6-3 conservative votes, 3 of which were nominated by Donald Trump himself, was engaged in a national or international deep state conspiracy to deny the rightful winner of the election his seat. I think that's ludicrous. I think that the evidence shows that the election was fair, and I think that Donald Trump bears an enormous responsibility for saying again and again and again and again ad nauseum that the election was stolen, that he had won by a landslide. He said before the election that if he didn't win, it would be clear that there had been a stolen election, that there had been election fraud. And so you didn't see this in Shays Rebellion. You don't see George Washington stirring this up. You don't see Patrick Henry stirring this up. You don't see the responsible people of the country uttering utter lies, self-serving, destructive, erosive, and corrosive lies to their more ardent followers. Well, if the President of the United States says to people who are disposed to admire him that the election was stolen, they're going to take that as truth, or they're certainly going to give that a lot of weight as their deciding what is true. And so that's the factor that does not exist in Shays Rebellion. And I think that Shays Rebellion was a legitimate, if troubling, rebellion, and the attack on the Capitol was illegitimate. But Jefferson, our friend, might say, but wait, this shows how much they care about liberty. This shows how much they're still engaged. They still want the country to be a democracy, a republic. And so I don't know, David, what he would say, but I fear that he would be more generous to the January 6th rebels than any one of us would really like.
I agree, and I go back to Jefferson's letter to Madison from January 30th of 1787, and I think that's the roadmap to understanding how Jefferson would react. And you, as Jefferson, did that. He was ready to give people the benefit of the doubt.
Generically, not necessarily in the circumstance. I was careful because I didn't want, that would be irresponsible for me to say, oh, those rebels were okay. As Jefferson, I think he would say, generally speaking, I'm disposed to think that a rebellion is something we should be sympathetic to.
Yes, but as you just said, if a president in power who is greatly admired by his supporters says this is the way it is and the election was stolen, you can hardly blame them for taking him seriously.
I think we dodged a much graver insurrection here, but I do think that the average person who somehow wound up in the statuary hall or in the House or Senate chamber honestly believed, on average, that A, the election was stolen because they had heard it from so many important Republican officials, and B, that they were doing the right thing, that they are the last true believers in the fundamental values of the founding fathers and the American Republic, that they're America's true patriots, and that the rest of us have either sold out or been deluded or been seduced.
Let's go back to Jefferson. He says, show mercy, pardon these people.
Let them up easy. Lincoln, after the war was won, said of the Confederates, let's let them up easy. That we share more than we disagree about, and that these people who stormed the Capitol, I'm sure that the great majority of them felt that this was they were called. They were called not only by the president, but by the basic understanding of American life. They believe it. And there's a certain innocence to it. I know that sounds like a hard thing to say, but I think that what Jefferson teaches us is that we should be pretty understanding of them, and that we should let them up easy. Now, I don't know whether they should be fined. I don't know whether they should be jailed. But these are fellow Americans, and if they're misguided, man, do we have a lot of educational work to do.
Yeah, people who did this probably didn't understand just how many laws they were breaking. They were just going into the Capitol. A lot of them, not all of them, certainly.
Any riot, any mob action, anywhere, there are distinctions to be made. There are people who are honest, true believers in the cause and who are well informed. And then there are people who are very badly informed. And then there are people who are just ruffians. There are people that just gravitate to chaos. They love it. They may be nonpartisan. They may be apolitical. And so you have to factor all. And then there could be people from the other side. There could be provocateurs who are trying to discredit this movement or that movement. We know all these things happen. But I would say that the great majority of the people who stormed the Capitol were true believers. And they believed what their president told them. He told them, I won the election by a landslide. The deep state is trying to have a coup d'etat. I'm counting on you to make it impossible for them to get away with it. I want you to march on the Capitol. I don't think that Donald Trump expected them to do what they did, but I think he expected them to march on the Capitol and to make their presence known in a big, big way. And I think he actually believed that they could maybe intimidate Mike Pence and the United States Senate to cast the election back on the states in some way, to force a recount or a re-election or who knows what. I think Trump expected that and wanted that. I don't think he knew what he was unleashing. I think his responsibility is through the roof, but he's not alone.
Well, I have to kind of try to take the other side and bring you down to the rationale that both sides felt passionate about this issue. One set of supporters and the other both believed that they were fighting for the future of America, that if the other side won, America was doomed.
I get that there are passions on both sides, and I've shown a lot of sympathy here, David, with the rebels, more than I want to, but I'm trying to take Jefferson's system. Jefferson says, beware of overreacting, beware of installing the very tyranny that you tried to put down, try to be generous, try to see if there's a legitimacy to the protest. If there is legitimacy, then you should accommodate that. If there's no legitimacy, then you should be careful and patient in educating people about the truth, but that it's in our interest to ratchet down both the rhetoric and the violence and the use of state apparatus for punitive measures. It's worth ratcheting that down in the name of a more harmonious nation. And here's the hard part. All that I can understand. Here's the part I can't understand, David, and you tell me what you think. I can't understand Jefferson saying, and you know what, it's kind of healthy anyway. It's just kind of healthy to see this happen from time to time. I'm just not sure I believe that. What about you?
Oh, I get that. I believe that absolutely. We need citizens that are engaged in government, that are informed, knowledgeable about current events and historical ones as well. I'm with Jefferson all the way on that.
So can you justify what happened on January 6th using that rubric?
I'm not trying to duck answering that question, but I am so glad that I am not in a position where I have to justify that. I do think it's important when we think about this to look at how much individuals have personally invested.
But when you realize that look, it's not as if this is just the election on November 3rd and then we all react in our opinions afterwards. There have been counts and recounts and audits and 60-some court cases. Doesn't that sort of secure? I mean, if the rebels could say there were 5 court cases where the judges said, yeah, it looks pretty fishy, then I would feel a lot more generous towards them. But how many cases would it take for them to realize the election was not stolen?
Yep, I'm with you. I'm not going to argue that. I agree. And it doesn't take very much work to get into this and recognize that there is no argument about that. But, we're human beings and we have a nature. I mean, if you go out and spend a lot of money on a new car, it's very hard for you to come back and say, yeah, I made a bad judgment here. It's a really bad car. Maybe that's a poor example, but it's hard for people to own up to mistakes of this magnitude. And we can't expect that to happen overnight.
But the Enlightenment says 2 things to us, David. It says, number one, a civil society finds a set of ground rules and bylaws or constitutional procedures to elect and diselect, to allow the people to express their will through mechanisms like the election of the Senate, like the Electoral College, like presidential elections and primaries and so on. That an enlightened society finds nonviolent ways to create a fair system for adjusting our disagreements and determining policy and determining who shall represent us. That's number one. And in this case, I feel that our society did that, and it did it in an orderly fashion. And I believe when former Attorney General William Barr says it was a fair election and there's no evidence of any widespread irregularities. The second thing that an Enlightenment society does is to create conditions in which the truth can be sorted out through evidentiary systems. And this isn't just Fox v. MSNBC. This is 60-some court cases where the former president paid a fortune to have lawyers travel all over the country and file brief after brief after brief after brief after brief alleging irregularities. This is exactly what you want. You want an arbiter who's just, who's nonpartisan, who stands on the outside of this dispute and says, okay, show us the evidence. If we see the evidence and we can determine that the election was rigged or something went wrong, that's a very serious issue, and we're going to want to attend to that. We may have to force a recount, or we may have to discredit certain types of votes. but it didn't happen. And so you have to ask, well, what would convince these people? And the answer is nothing. The only thing that would have convinced them is if Donald Trump had said on November 4th, yeah, man, I'm so sorry, I'm the better guy, and I certainly will be a much better president, but the fact looks to me as if the people have spoken and Joe Biden won, so I'm going to concede. I still think there might have been some irregularities, but I do think I have to concede that the election is over, that it was essentially fair, that I have been defeated, and that that's how our system works. If he had said that, there would have been no insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th.
I agree completely, and I'm on your side. Don't get me wrong, but I'm hanging on to this letter that Jefferson wrote to Madison, and trying to be conciliatory. And I guess in the end, it comes down for me to my belief that our nation, having gone through all of this in the past month, in the past 6 months, the past 4 years, we are now a stronger country for it. I want to believe that.
I hope you're right. We've only touched
Well,
this.
it's your fault. You're the guy, man. You filled me with this Jeffersonian optimism. What do you expect?
I hope you're right, David. Just let me remind you that this is the lesser problem of Jefferson and violence. He defended the French Revolution, including the Reign of Terror, and he wrote that famous letter to his protege, William Short, in which he said if there were one Adam and one Eve alive in every nation and alive free, that would be better than the present. Think of that. One Adam, one Eve. He would be willing to eliminate the entire population except one couple that could reproduce the earth as if it was the day after an atomic annihilation of the planet. This is a wild man. My point is that Jefferson is capable of some pretty wild talk because liberty for him is so important that he's not afraid to see a little bloodshed as long, and I'm being John Adams, as long as he gets to stay in his little mountain retreat in Virginia and write polite letters with a quill pen and handmade ink. He's not down in those street actions. He's not part of this. He's a philosopher writing from Jupiter about people killing each other. 5 people died on January 6th, and others have been damaged, wounded. Some are going to lose their eyesight. Some are going to have a limp for the rest of their lives. I mean, this is not some little game of shenanigans. It's not like a riot after a football victory somewhere. This is like, wow, the stakes are really high. They're trashing the Capitol of the United States. And if they had gotten AOC, and maybe if they had gotten to Mike Pence, we might be talking about the assassination of duly elected leaders of our country.
Well, geez, thanks a lot for that. I had this balloon filled with Jeffersonian optimism, and you've just taken a sharp object to it. And
don't you agree with both points of view? I know.
I do. But with that, sir, I think we need to bring the conversation this week to a close. For more information on the Jefferson Hour or to support the show, go to jeffersonhour.com. We thank you all very much for listening this week.
And if you want to join our online course on Hamlet, 4 sections, or our online course on J. Robert Oppenheimer and the making of the atomic bomb, or our online course on Great Plains history and literature, go to jeffersonhour.com. But for now, spirited conversation, one I've been dreading because I'm so troubled by Jefferson, and yet I see his point of view. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.